You're listening to RevOps FM with Justin Norris. Welcome to RevOps FM. Today, we're going to tackle a subject that is not for the faint of heart, quote to cash. It's tough, it's technical, it's complicated. So we're going to chat with two guys who are some of the best in the business, Nick Rose and Tony Tarantino from Hyperscayle. I've actually known Nick and Tony for quite a while. They were clients of mine back when I was on the agency side. They worked for a SaaS company called Mendix, later acquired by Siemens. But now for the past few years, Nick and Tony have been building their own RevOps agency called Hyperscayle, where quote to cash is a big area of focus. So I'm super excited to deep dive on this topic today. Fellas, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Funny how things have turned.
It really is. I mean, before we dive into the theme of the day, I'd love to understand the process from your point of view of going from the in-house world, setting up your own shop, what drove you there, the challenges. Just love to hear a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so we got bought by Siemens, and Tony's worked for Accenture. I worked for Dell. We've been in the large corporation side for a very long time. We both went to the startups side and done successful. We got to a buyout. But the question really kind of came up for like, what's the next thing? And we really wanted to be into RevOps overall, into the RevOps space. Personally, I was looking out and interviewing, and I couldn't find a place that I wanted to go work for personally because they all had some of the same issues. And I just didn't want to go the same rim and mortar of going through the same process and not really having a lot of control and playing the politics. And Ben and I were sitting on the train, and Ben's like, why don't we just start our own company? And I was just like, you are crazy. And, after more and more, some certain things happened at Mendix and Siemens. And I was like, you know what? Let's go and do it, right? We started off on our own, mainly because we want to have more control in our own destiny, kind of create a culture of what we wanted a company to be. And so we did that, and it has been amazing. If you ask me, we would be where we are today, I would tell you no, but we've been growing like crazy and having a lot of fun, really trying to solve more of customers' big pain points and problems. And, it's been great. Tony, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, the big thing for me was as we scaled Mendix, we started a 50-person company to, I think it was close to 5,000 when we left. Did a lot of things right, made a lot of mistakes, learned a lot of lessons. I wanted to take those lessons and apply them elsewhere, and this was the perfect opportunity to do so, is to learn from all the things we did right and all the things we did wrong, and help other companies put that foundation to scale from a RevOps perspective in place. And I thought that was a super fun challenge to solve. And every company is a little bit different, but it's still the basis of getting your data in place, getting your process in place, getting your systems in place. And I just love that challenge, and be able to do it over and over and over again is super exciting to me.
I've been through a bit of that agency experience myself. And when you think about like your product and positioning and like what your menu of service offerings is going to be, there's a few different ways to play it. In my past life, we were really focused on one platform and going deep into that ecosystem. And you've chosen more of like a discipline strategy where you're focused on RevOps as a discipline. You have a broad menu of products that you partner with. How did you think about what sort of agency you wanted to be in terms of service offering?
Ooh, good question. I don't know if we really thought much about it, to be honest. It was like, we know we're good at lead to cash. I knew marketing ops and sales ops really well, and even customer success ops. We had people that could play in all those areas. And I think one of the things that we've centered around is it's really hard to have marketing ops people work on systems and not have a downstream impact if they don't know what happens like on the Salesforce or CRM side, and vice versa, right? There's been countless of times when even bigger companies are doing something on the sales side and they mess up the marketing side, right? Because they don't know the downstream or upstream impacts. And so I think, or I kind of mean Tony drew the line in the sand. I was like, if we're going to go do this, we're going to do lead to cash, and this is going to be our competitive advantage. And we're going to know what happens from downstream and upstream. And so I think it was just more like, this is who we are, what we're going to be. In particular, we're in RevOps.
I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode, Knack. I love marketing automation software, but let's be honest, the email and landing page builders are usually terrible. You can't make it nice without a developer, and marketers are going to find a way to break things or go off brand. You do not have time for that. So Knack is totally different. You set the guidelines and then give your users a building experience that's slick, modern, and beautiful. When they're done, everything goes to your map at the push of a button. And don't worry, it supports global teams, approval workflows. It's got your integrations. So head on over to revops.fm/knack. That's KNAK, and get a special offer just for my listeners.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'm a huge believer in understanding the end-to-end business process of every client that I work on. Like, I want to understand from market to cash, like how data flows, how it's structured, the architecture of the systems. And if we're going to do that, we're going to spend the time to learn all that information. Might as well support all those elements of that process as well. So that was like a big driver for me, is like removing the silos and making sure that we're thinking about every project, every solution, every functionality that we build as kind of how it impacts not only the individual piece of the process that we're working on, but downstream and upstream.
I think there's huge advantage to being able to position yourself as solving a business problem rather than being like, I'm your Marketo shop or I'm your HubSpot shop or whatever. So I want to dive into the big picture of quote to cash, and I'll confess it's not an area that I'm super well versed in. I've touched bits and pieces of it in different ways. But taking on the standard big process of rolling out CPQ and rolling out some of these systems, it's not something I've done. So I'd love, for the benefit of myself and perhaps others who haven't gone deep there, maybe just set the stage for what this is, why it's important.
Yeah, so kind of let's start with the definitions between quote to cash and CPQ, right? Because they're usually synonymous together, but they really usually do separate projects. And some of it's kind of obvious. But I think when people go into these motions, they kind of get lost, especially within the organizations. But quote to cash is really the business process from when, obviously when sales creates a quote or configure something like that. And then it goes into what we say cash, which would be turning from an opportunity into a quote, into an order or invoice, and then the collections process, right, between the business side, right? So capturing that from a NetSuite or ERP system for the money. Not really sexy by any means, right? But like those are the pieces. And there's a lot of business process that goes underneath that, which makes it complex because you're usually having to bring in sales, could be marketing, depending on where it sits, which some people don't realize, right? Especially if you're looking at like a product or product marketing side standpoint, operations, but in finance. Now the CPQ section, configure price quote, usually the details around how do you get sales to create a quote, configuring out and getting into the part of that, which is a sub piece of that process. But it's also really important because when you talk about getting things to move harmoniously between the systems, a very good example, like usually your CPQ and ERP systems have to mirror. And if you don't do that process well, you can create a lot more work for your manual work, right? But that business process is important because it all ties back into the CPQ process. That's kind of like setting the stage there. And, really it's important is, especially when you do it from a scaling perspective, after like 20 salespeople or 50 salespeople, a lot of times they don't have a quoting process, but that's when they'll kind of like start looking into it because the cost savings, the time for them to somehow do some of these quotes, especially if they're complex, just becomes way more worth it. Or configuring out costs. Like sometimes we've done these CPQ systems because there's a business problem on, say, like the warranty or the support side, and it's costing them millions of dollars to go fix those support because sales is selling something incorrectly or wrong or missing the item. And from a CS side, they have to go support that, right?
I think the other thing that I would add is how often that I've seen clients who have the sales process well documented, well figured out, well implemented in their systems, but we're leaving so much money on the table because everything post-sales they weren't focusing on. And that's so important because that's how you're getting paid. That's how you're generating cash. That's how you're invoicing your customers. It's such an important part of your total go-to-market process that is sometimes, especially technically, underserved. Like there's companies that have full Salesforce CRM teams that have one part-time NetSuite consultant who's not handling the ERP stuff at all. It's a really, really important process that is actually doing the revenue generation. It is invoicing that you're getting paid for that I'm always amazed about how so many companies don't focus enough and are missing thousands of dollars because they don't have their invoice process buttoned up and aren't getting the revenue that they need.
And like the industry's kind of like commoditized it in some ways, but it's really complicated because like no one really owns the CPQ process if you think about it, but then everyone also owns it because usually the people that have to control it only control bits and pieces of it. That's what makes it really complicated. So like finance would own like the approval process, but usually sales wants to own the approval process. And a lot of times we'll have troubles with that because everyone wants to be in the approval process. And usually you have 13 people in the approval process. Like, guys, you can't have 13 people. But those are the humans that are aspects into that because everyone wants to touch it. And then you get to things like product or product marketing. Like, someone has to define this playbook that encapsulates what actually needs to be configured and priced. And a lot of times people don't have that figured out, or the structure or strategy to go to that. Someone else owns that. And usually you have ops in the middle, like going like, hey, we need to push this together and trying to push and pull these organizations, but they don't understand the full piece. That's what makes it what's so complicated. No one owns it, but everyone does at the same time.
CPQ, I think, is truly the single hub that is relevant to every single go-to-market group that there is. Like sales, marketing, finance, CS, all have a really, really important need for a CPQ that fills their need. So it's the one thing in all of our go-to-market processes that literally touches every single relevant group. And with obviously more people at the table, more opinions, that's a lot of the struggles you see with CPQ is everyone's got an opinion on how it should go. They have such a huge role. It impacts their lives so much. That's what makes this work really complicated.
You took it just actually where I was going to go. I was just reflecting on all the different players involved, product marketing, kind of defining those packages in many cases, sales actually being the ones who have to work with them, users of the system, finance being stakeholders because everything then has to mirror over into the ERP world. It's hard enough sitting down as like a marketing operations consultant or a sales operations consultant with just one or two stakeholders. When you've got 4, 5, 6 departments, what does that engagement look like for you just from a design and discovery phase? That must be fun.
So one of the things that we always require is an executive leader. And the executive leader has to sit above everyone. Because installing or setting up the technology for CPQ is not hard, I would say, in a lot of sense. And Tony will jump in and probably say there's some subtle nuances and things like that. But like, we're not doing rocket science. The things that make it harder, where delays come from, are people. And it's usually politics that comes out of it most. I'll give you a great example. We've had 2 times. It's like, who owns what the product book needs to look like? And if you haven't had a clear product definitions of how you want to go sell something, how is the system supposed to handle it and take it in, and how is sales you're supposed to handle and configure and quote that, right? Especially if you're supposed to define what's on the back of the truck, so to speak, right? For sales. Once the back of the truck is defined, and that's what they can go sell. A lot of times we'll use synonyms like sales is selling a deck. They don't care what nails are in those SKUs, whatever else is in the deck, or how many pieces of lumber. They know they're selling a deck. You're selling a solution. You guys need to tell them what's in that. But if they don't have that configured, sales doesn't know if they need to sell a 2-story deck or a 3-story deck. How much more weight do they need to go have? If that's not defined, easy enough for a person to understand, you're never going to have it in place enough for a system to understand, especially if there's too many decisions. And so like, that's one great example where I would say probably like 60 or 70% of CPQ projects like stall is one is like everything else is specialized, or they don't really have that defined yet for what like the 80-20 rule exists for their company.
You asked a question about how the design process goes, and that made me chuckle. But I think the design process always goes really smoothly. All the people at the table are very excited about, we can automate approvals and we can remove all of these clicks I have to make, and my email is going to decrease. It's going to be great. I love letting the system do the work. But it always breaks down when it becomes real. Like at the point of like, okay, now that we're no longer going to remove approvals from every single group of a closed deal, and you have to trust the system to do its work, that's when everyone freaks out, and that's what actually slows down the deal. So like early on, they love it. They love the idea of automating. They love the idea of being removed from the process. But as it gets closer and they get to a real point where, oh no, I'm not going to have eyes on every single deal that goes through our system. I have to trust the system and trust the data. That's when everyone freaks out and decides that we have to slow down, and they get scared of that change. That's so important.
Yeah, Tony makes a good point on this. And usually times are like, we thought this work would be a lot quicker. Yeah, but by the time we get to this point of approvals, or we get to this point of me go live, we're not going to make that, because everything that everyone's agreed on, they're going to stop at the 1-yard line. And we're going to have to go back, and you as an executive leader is going to have to push them to make sure that they're okay with it. And that's really hard for some people. If you don't have like an executive sponsor from a design process to help force those decisions, saying this is where we go, the design process is easy, but that piece gets really rough.
I'm curious if there's a dividing line between where you would recommend a company needs this sort of infrastructure in place and where you're like, you're good. Like I'm thinking of new company rolls out a product and maybe they've got like tiers like freemium, pro, team, just very simple. And they don't have that many salespeople. Is there a place where like, you're good, keep going for a bit more and you don't need this yet?
It very much, and I hate this answer, but it's the answer I'm going to give. It very much depends. And I think CPQ specifically is so dependent on the complexity of your product offering that if you have a fairly straightforward product, thinking about like us at Mendex, okay, we sold a platform and that was it. We never needed CPQ because it wasn't relevant regardless of how big we got. But if you have a fairly straightforward product, you can get by a lot longer without introducing complexity to the CPQ. But that being said, like if you have a lot of specific bundles and packages and product configuration rules and all these different things that are important to success of your customers, and then I would even say earlier is probably like earlier than you would think a CPQ is necessary is important. So like again, a long non-answer, but the idea is it very much depends on how complex your product configuration is and how you're trying to sell it.
Yeah, so my monetary answer back into like it depends on the complexity of the product, right? And so if you have something that has a lot more quote and line items, right, and the cost of getting that wrong is higher on the customer support or service side, and you're talking 200 and 500K more cost to the business, then there's probably a good reason like you should go look at a CPQ system, right? And that could be 5 reps, 10 reps, doesn't really matter. It'll depend on the ASP of what you have, right? But like if you back into a system cost, you can get a CPQ system for 1,500K, depending on what you are for the volume of transactions. So like from a customer standpoint, if that is a leakage in the funnel, that's a great area to go at it. From the sales side, if the cost of them from a time perspective is saving them roughly around the same amount of cost and time, right? And it's an easy way to go figure out if you cut the quoting process for rep down to an hour times the number of costs, 600 hours, that equals close to like 100 to 500K. And then, yeah, there's probably a good reason to go do a CPQ from that standpoint, right? Because your ROI is going to be anywhere from like 5 to 10x at that point, and it will be an easy scaling conversation, right? That's the monetary answer backed into the complexity of the coding process.
No, it makes sense. And so thinking about like CPQ as a system and just the process of rolling that out, as I said, I've never done that hands-on, but I've been adjacent to many of them, most often in the context of like, we'd like to do this project, but we have to wait till next fiscal year when the Salesforce team is finished with their CPQ project. It's always this sort of like looming goblin under the bed or this menacing thing that is going on in the background somehow that's never going to end. And so I'm just wondering, why does this tend to be so bumpy and complicated? We talked about the people side. Are there technical reasons, or is it really just the organization ends up getting bogged down somewhere along one of these milestones?
The organization usually gets bogged down on one of these milestones, right? And a lot of times there are technically, and I'll go into technical pieces, right? But they'll get bogged down, and usually it's a lot of rework back from the CPQ team. But there are technical pieces, and like if you're going to like integrations between like CPQ system within the CRM back to an ERP, those get really complicated, right? And a lot of times too, those systems have to mirror each other, right? And there's like integration IFS tools such as like MuleSoft, Boomi, Shilago, and I usually would recommend Boomi or something like that. Those systems need to talk to each other. Now, the problem, though, what makes it difficult is those systems have to sync. What I mean by that is the product book that is in CRM has to match the product book in the finance side. Oftentimes, when this is a first-time install at a company that has not done this, they usually don't match. And finance is not taking an easy way of looking at it for the contracts or something else for invoicing, and the sake of simplifying the process. Or sales has done something different from what finance has, but like that takes time to match up. And so like we're going through a great example where we're having to amend and do all the contracts for our customer back and rewriting them back into the ERP system. So when we go back into the CPQ, they match back for when item gets sent across as a sales order back into NetSuite. And so like those are some of the technical pieces that happen that from a business process are awry because they were doing it correctly, but that labor or work has to happen to get it right. And sometimes people don't realize that when they do the CPQ project, because not a lot of people in the company, however, go do one, right? So you're not like installing CPQs every year, right? So you don't have a lot of experience out of that. And that's why you should look at an agency. But those are the things that happen that slow it down.
Yeah, and I think a couple things come to mind for me, and I think that the big one, I mean, we talked about kind of the product catalog and make sure that's well defined. That's obviously important, but there's very often I find so much tribal knowledge that lives within sales groups, like how they sell things, how they configure their products, how they configure a product. It's not documented at all. You have a senior salesperson; it's all in their head. And like the process of getting that out, making it real, making it systematic enough where you can build logic to support that is always very cumbersome. That's always a huge problem. So many companies have these sales guys that just know how to quote, and they've been doing it for a long time, and they have never written it down, and that's a process. Another thing to Nick's point is that you have these organizations that have Salesforce teams because they use Salesforce every day, or CRM teams, and buy Salesforce versus CPQ, and they think they can just automate Salesforce within their CPQ, not realizing like how different those functionalities are, and they don't necessarily play super well together. So I've seen a lot of my clients have these really complex CPQ that's all like automated with flows and Apex and just like really complex Salesforce specific functionality while under leveraging all of the CPQ stuff that's built to be CPQ. So again, back to the point of make sure that you understand and are experts in the system that you're using for your CPQ and not forcing your automation that you know how to build to work with CPQ, because that's going to have downstream impacts big time.
Tony, I'm just really curious as you described that to dig into like a concrete example. You could make one up if you like, but what's like a configuration process and what would be like the CPQ way of doing it? And then how do people duct tape it with Salesforce automation?
Not to get too technical and bore our audience, but
they can go technical. They won't be bored.
Okay. I think the big one that you see is when a quote is created, you want to automate all of this stuff. When a quote is created, you want to automate to automatically add this product and get with this price point and configure this together and do all of this stuff. And because again, you know Salesforce, you know Flow. It's a very nice tool, very easy to use. So go create a flow to go do that. When in reality, CPQ, Salesforce CPQ specifically, is a product built on Force.com, but has all this back-end code that's running that's based on actual individual records, price rules, product rules. So you basically go to the record, to the tab in Salesforce, create a price rule, create a product rule, and it will allows you to do all of that logic within the interface of CPQ. Because that already exists, if you automate on top of that, both of those pieces of logic or functionality running at the same time, and it's going to bog down your system. So like once people do that and then their quotes get large and their system times out all the time, they're like, what's going on? It's because you're basically automating on top of already existing automation because you didn't properly utilize the actual built for CPQ piece of automation.
We've seen this multiple times. Like that timeout happens and you see your whole Salesforce instance timing out. And so you're like, oh, Apex timeout issues or CPU issues. You're like, wait, this is a cloud instance. Like, why is this happening, right? And it's because you basically cut it in half.
Yeah, that's weird, eh? So they kind of get a car and then they hook it up to horses and get the horses to pull the car without turning on the car's engine.
That's a very, very good analogy. Because they know horses, and I get it. Like, I know Salesforce. I've been looking at Salesforce for a long time.
Got these ones.
I bought a Salesforce product. I should be able to use Salesforce, but that's not the reality.
Marketers, it's planning season. Time to live in your office with the world's biggest spreadsheet and hope that finance doesn't slash your budget. Listen, planning is tough, but at least you can put your best foot forward with a structured framework that covers all the bases. Our friends at Uptempo have just launched the Blueprint for Marketing Planning. It's a totally free and comprehensive guide for enterprise marketing teams. You'll get a 7-step planning process that integrates top-down strategy with bottom-up execution and gives you a crystal clear picture of how you'll hit your number. Even finance will be impressed. Get your free copy now at revops.fm/plan. That's really interesting. And so like a lot of the things that we're trying to configure when we think of like price books and products, like we just make these things up. And I was just in a conversation today about their product marketing team, like how many different ways you can slice and dice this. You can have different plans that include features. You can have core products and then like upsell products. You can take the stuff that your system or your product offering does and arrange it in a lot of different ways. Do you technically see that this is underdeveloped, or is it over-architected, over-engineered, and should be simplified? How do you see the impact here from a product marketing point of view?
I wouldn't necessarily say from product marketing. I have seen where it gets away from product marketing, it gets overdeveloped. Like when you consider like partner SKUs. Oh, well, we need to give every option to the partner. Because we need to give every option to the partner, we create 15,000 different bundles. Nobody asks the question like, oh, how many are they actually going to sell? So then you end up only using like 5 SKUs out of 100 instead of everything else, which creates it more to maintain and a bigger playbook and everything else. But when it gets out of hands from product marketing standpoint, but most of the time it'll be overcomplicated, right? Oh, we need to have different versions because of this edge case to sell. Well, sales doesn't feel really confident that they need to have every option in case they didn't go down to. Well, no, sales, it goes back down to the 80-20 rule. Like, you guys only sold 2 of these bundles in the year. And so, like, I think a lot of people will come with like anecdotal evidence, not really looking at factual information. So either way, you go through the process, you have it for a year, and then you go, all right, guys, this is how many bundles you actually sold of this, and then cut it. But most of the time I see them being overly complicated. I haven't really seen any problems with people overly simplifying it. I mean, have you, Tony? I can't imagine any.
It's not necessarily overly simplifying, but I do have numerous examples in my head of companies that are paying for CPQ, and their CPQ instance is just a long list of products that their salesperson are going in and searching for the right one and adding it. Like, there are scenarios like that where, because they don't have that process well defined, they're just have done the bare minimum of CPQ, or maybe are just using it for the approval side of the house, which again, maybe there's a use case there. But there are elements of not using the capabilities of CPQ as they're meant to be used. I've seen that plenty of times as well. So honestly, I was thinking about it as you're asking that question, and I've seen both sides of the equation very often, where it's like, I've seen a lot of like, why is it so complicated? Your business process it's not that unique. And also a lot of other ones that are like, you're paying a lot of money for this application, you're not really using it as it's meant to be used. So I've definitely seen both sides of the coin for sure.
Do you guys have a preferred like Goldilocks zone between the place where every single feature is almost like its own product, and as you're describing that, I'm like, well, you could use native Salesforce quotes and native Salesforce products and just like build it up, like a list of ingredients and a recipe. So there's that extreme. And then there's the other extreme where like every single possible combination is like bundled as a separate SKU, and you have the 15,000 SKUs. And like you also described, what's the happy path in between there that gives you some efficiency of things already being put together without making it too rigid and hard to adapt to?
It's honestly a really good question. It's something that we're still trying to figure out because, again, it is complex. And I think with CPQ specifically, because it's so dependent on, again, the products and the product configuration, it all goes back to that kind of monetary quantitative calculation you need to go do of like, if I were to bundle this out, how many deals am I making a year with this particular configuration? How much money is it? How much time is it saving my salespeople? Are there things that are often left off that is costing us revenue down the line? Like, it's really about finding those pain points and understanding quantitatively, like, where can we use our system to minimize times that our salespeople are spending, minimize mistakes. And I think that's kind of where you find that answer. And there's not really a one size fits all here, I don't think. It's all about the complexity of the product and the pains that they're currently feeling. It's all about doing that double click. And that's why discovery and understanding the end-to-end process is so important, because I need to understand what is their driver, why are they doing this, what is their go-to-market process, like what are the salespeople actually selling. And when I do CPQ projects, I listen to sales calls. I will take time and I will just listen to how are the salespeople talking about this product to clients, like how are they bundling these conversations. I think it's really, really important in telling me what I need to know about how they're thinking about it is how I want to make sure that I build it so their language is mirrored within the system.
Right. Because for SaaS, you have to mirror the selling process. It's not like with your deck example. And I have a brother-in-law who's a carpenter and builds decks, and he's kind of got it in his head where he can say, all right, I'm going to build a deck. It's this big. I know I need this much lumber, this many nails, this many screws. Like, he can kind of figure that out. But with SaaS, it's like you can just do it any which way. It's all just make-believe, so to speak.
Well, and it gets even more complicated when you do like software and product, right? There's a company we worked with that did warehouse bots and software along with that. That's a really complicated selling process. It gets really costly too. So going back to the Goldilocks answer, it really depends on the product and offer, I think, more than anything else for the complexity of that. But like to your point, like that tribal knowledge, like someone knows it. It's just how do you pull it out and get it written down into a good structure?
So getting opinionated about tech for a second, do you have an ideal stack? No budget, just put in the best of breed for CPQ tech. What would your stack look like?
I think it depends on what is the CRM and what is the ERP. Those are the first two questions, because a lot of times we see a lot of Salesforce and NetSuite. And then the next question comes down to is like, how complicated is the quote and how many line items for the quote? If they're in HubSpot, like, I mean, the HubSpot feature for quoting can get you pretty far, honestly. Most of the feature sets in HubSpot, right? It's a mile wide or it goes an inch deep, but like a lot of people don't need much more than that. So I think those are the questions we ask is like, all right, how complicated is the quote? What CRM instead of ERP? So then it's not a really complicated quote process. I would stick to like a Salesforce or a Steelbrick because Steelbrick, I like it. It's nice in that sense because you don't have to do a lot of customization. It's pretty like straightforward on the quote guide path. For most businesses, it will work really, really well. When you get into like SaaS or subscription offerings, like Tony, you got more thoughts about some of those other pieces. What would you like?
Yeah, another thing that I think is really unique about CPQ, it can include so many different things. Like CPQ can just be quoting, can just be guided selling, but it can also include your closed deal approvals. It can include your contract management. It can include maybe some CPQs that again extend beyond and also is like a light ERP. So like document generation, quote generation, it can do all those different things. And when you're evaluating the tool that you want to use, like which of those are important to you. Subscription management, another one. Like Salesforce CPQ is not a great subscription management tool, so that maybe go to Zora route or use that. There's so many different variables of different pieces of functionality that you can buy within a CPQ instance. It's about finding what's the most important to you, what you're going to use, and then picking the best in breed of those individual. And I do like Salesforce CPQ because it's pretty good at all of that. It provides an element of all of those individual pieces pretty well. But like if you really wanted a super advanced approval process as part of your quote approval process, there's probably a better tool that does a little bit better than you. So it's just all about finding the different pieces of functionality that is CPQ driven. What do you care the most about? What are you going to leverage the most out of that group? And then you decide from there.
Yeah, and I would say most of the time in that sense, like we see like, it'll be like a Salesforce instance, CRM, NetSuite, you do like a Steelbrick or the Salesforce CPQ, and then you do like a NetSuite suite billing if it's a SaaS or subscription management, right? Because like there's not really a good subscription management feature set, all that. So it just depends on what you're going for. Those are kind of like the main setups. I would probably say a large portion of them are out there. If you have a really good complex subscription management piece that matters and kind of goes up and down, then like Zora would probably be better, especially if you want to do a lot of customization. Because if you're doing a lot of customization, that's where Salesforce, I would say, doesn't do so well, right? Because it's not set up for that. You're using the wrong tool. If you need to build your own adventure, so to speak, right? And it's got a lot of the complexities into it. You just can't customize it as much.
So you've got CRM, and I think we all know what that is. You've got ERP, which is your finance playground. And then CPQ, which is more about how do salespeople configure a quote in terms of adding products and SKUs and bundles and all those things. And then there's this CLM or contract lifecycle management, like whole document generation piece. Is that an optional thing for some companies, or is that always part of the solution?
Again, it goes back to how complicated is the contract, right? So let's take SaaS, right? Because I think a lot of people follow SaaS and it's usually the living piece of that. Some companies, you'll have legal review every contract, and there's going to be a lot of pieces that need to be like redline, changed, etc. And that usually needs a full CLM contract life management for that, and getting a system in like that place like DocuSign or something is going to be really important, or Conga, for example. Those are usually the main two, I would say, but those are needed because you just have to have the legal reference and framework that's in the company. But you'll have some companies that are click to buy, product led growth, doesn't even have to touch a contract, and you don't need it. It depends on your quoting process, which I hate to answer, but it does.
I think about accounting systems, and funnily enough, a lot of my first jobs when I was going through college were kind of in the accounting world. I was like a bookkeeper. I've worked with ACPAC, I've worked with QuickBooks, so I have a decent understanding of accounting systems. They don't tolerate data quality issues to the same degree. Like we talk about dirty data in CRM, I'm not saying every accounting system is perfect, but you need to balance at the end of the day. In this business process, which is about actually putting data back and forth between those two worlds of like sort of order and then sometimes semi-anarchy, how do you bridge the data quality gap between those two places?
The major difference here, and again, every CPQ quote to cash project that we do, there's always going to be an element of a manual process. And I think that very point of when you close a deal, when an account is transferring to a customer, like that data integrity is so important. That's where you really, really need a deal desk, a team, a process of someone that is confirming that data, making sure that that data is correct before it enters the next stage in its life cycle. So like that part, I totally agree. It's so important. You cannot have dirty data in your ERP. You cannot have dirty data in your finance system because revenue impacting mistakes. As much as I'm automation and system driven, you need human eyes sometimes. And that's like the scenario where I always will say, hey, let's think about who needs to confirm this deal, who needs to confirm the data, make sure that the paper contract matches your quote. And again, CPQ will help with a lot of that, but there's always needs to be an element of human eyes here because of, to your very point, you can't have data mistakes in your accounting system.
You go back to the original question, I was just like, why did we start Hyperscayle? Like, this is kind of like the exact reason. Because if you go with like an implementer, like a Conga or whatever else out there that's totally around that, like they're going to focus on that part of the data and the technology piece going in there, which is like perfectly fine. Like that's what they're set for. I'm not trying to dog on them, so to speak, but like they're not going to come back and ask the business process or the business question back to you as the person of like, how does my closing process or business deal desk need to go work? And if you don't have one, if you've never done one, like it's the blind leading the blind. And it's important in this case, right? Because the finance data piece of data quality should never even be in question if the business process or the deal desk process is closed very well, because like that is the last line of defense, so to speak, to get into the finance system and make sure it's right and everything is good, and to ensure data quality happens on the finance side.
Is it usually only when a deal closes that ERP kind of enters the picture in terms of passing data over, or is it before that even sometimes?
Deal closes, cancellations, renewals in those aspects, those would be big things, I would say, right? Like contract and money generating events. But you'd also have from the ERP side back into the CRM side of like bill collections, dunning process, right? Late for that piece, something issue and payment that can come up through that. You could also have renewals that come back from a time perspective too, how that you want to go through it, but then also tie back into like support pieces, right? Or credits. So short answer is no, but there's a way longer answer on that one too.
I think my point of view there is if finance had it their way, yes, their data would be over in the ERP as soon as possible. But you would need a really, really, really tight data management process. You need a really tight integration, know exactly like when that data is being pushed over, when it's updated. Like you need to have that process really well defined and feel really good about your data. That's why most of the clients that we work with don't have that. So that's why I always say, wait until the deal closes, wait until human eyes have been on it, and then we'll push that data, because that's when I feel most comfortable with it. In a perfect world, like if I had more control over the end-to-end process, I do agree it would be nice to have it there earlier, but that's not the world that we live in. Like most of the time, there's data is not ready to be pushed to the ERP until, again, it's been closed, and we've gone through that kind of deal desk process.
So then when I think about the role of RevOps here, obviously quoting is inherently a sales and a RevOps process, but the cash part, like it's much more finance-led, and contracts is very much legal. And yet I do see like quote to cash very often listed as one of the responsibilities in RevOps job descriptions. So I guess my question is, how did RevOps kind of end up at the center here? Is this a good thing for the profession of RevOps? And what is the role that we as a discipline have to play?
So I think it's a good thing. RevOps just entered this role, right? Because like back to my original statement, like everyone owns it, but no one owns it. And if no one owns it, someone needs to fill in that role. And usually RevOps is the best person to go fill in that role because they already interface with everyone and they can understand to be like the arbiters, right? Or mediators between the different groups. And they can also lead the group down the right path, making sure they can explain why do we need to do X and Y, and the reason why does you have impact on this person's impacted job. Because most of the time, if you have legal, they don't understand the sales process necessarily. It's very few in between, or legal doesn't understand the finance process, and vice versa. You got people trying to learn about the different roles and everything else that slows it down. And so I do think this is good and is growing more of what RevOps and ownership is now. Does that have some negative impacts and other impacts? Negative is not the right word, right? But like if RevOps is filling these roles, I think it does have some other impacts into the organizations around like system ownership and things like that, right? Between like the business process, who owns actually doing the work of the system. Because I see that shifting and moving up more towards RevOps and owning the full thing, where like, what is IT's role in that? And that's a whole conversation we can get to later on. But like, that's where I see like that trade-off though, is because they have to go fill that role.
And yeah, you kind of anticipated where my next thought was going to be around like IT, business systems. There's a lot of companies now where you have a go-to-market systems role or business systems function. It's kind of IT with another label that are owning a lot of these. How do you see RevOps interfacing with these, or what's the ideal ownership state from your point of view?
Tony and I have this debate and conversation every, I swear, 3 months. And I feel like he keeps coming more and more to my side. I'm going to make a statement that I think IT is phasing themselves out of a job, right? That might scare a lot of people, or some people might argue with that. But if you think about it, you go to Scott Breaker's slides of how much technology we've had in the last, 10 years, 150, 200,000 different pieces of technology that's been commoditized for the business user. The IT side doesn't understand the business. They've gone deep down the path of code and everywhere else. They become all in from index of low code development, no code, things like that. They have lost grasp of what the business is, or they need to have requirements to a certain T, which kind of shifted them down the organization overall. And so no, is IT still important? I think they're still important. So I don't say you diminish, get rid of them, they're gone. But the roles are diminished very much down to governance, because a lot of times we see is RevOps taking more ownership for the business operations team, because they're closer to the business process. Goes off the IT. And a lot of times the sales organizations, the marketing organizations who are paying the budgets for those people don't get the answers that they need and ownership. It's an interesting question you asked, Justin, because I feel like that's more and more coming towards RevOps and more coming towards the business side. And that other section is not necessarily with IT. And IT handles more governance and security, which could be a whole other topic debate we can go into for hours on end.
I spent most of my career in an IT focused role in an IT group. IT has been my managers for a good portion of my career. And I do agree that IT is that close to the business. In today's world, and we deal with this with our clients all the time, they're becoming blockers more than they're becoming enablers. And that's an inherent problem for IT. That being said, I'm also scared of a world where kind of RevOps, business-focused people are owning your data and owning your systems, and they don't have the understanding of governance and data integrity and all the different things you need to think about, and security and all these things that are super relevant from an IT perspective is going to be lost on a business-focused RevOps person. So again, I don't disagree that IT needs to potentially reevaluate the role they play in a lot of these organizations, but there's a place for them, and there's a place for finding the right balance between the red tape and the making sure that we're being as safe as possible and minimizing defects and minimizing data issues versus just getting in the way of actual value creation from a RevOps group with our systems of records. It's a tough, and I mostly agree with Nick at this point, where he asked me a year ago and it was very, very different. But I do think there's a place for IT, especially if it becomes CPQ, because we talk about CPQ as being that true hub of all these different systems of record and revenue generating processes. And if you don't understand the integration, if you don't understand how the system architecture of how data moves up and down your processes, you can cause some major upstream and downstream impacts. So I do think there's a role there. But again, ownership of the development and solutioning of a CPQ, it probably should be RevOps with IT support from a development standpoint as providing the governance that is necessary.
It's funny, like many things, I find this problem that has a few spectrums. And it's hard to maximize both sides of it, but you want your people working on these projects to be very close to the business, to have business acumen. So that's all right, RevOps or people embedded in functions so that they understand requirements and so that they're thinking more about the business side and not just the IT only looking at things through the lens of technology and governance and this fortress mentality. At the same time, you don't want people who lack kind of respect for elegance in architecture and systems, because then you end up with technical debt and then you end up with things poorly implemented. So that speaks more to IT skills, specialized domain knowledge, centralization, so that those people can work well together. So there's this tension all the time, and I don't know how you end up with the perfect happy medium between the two things. I think we're yet to figure that out.
In my experience so far, in the last 20 years, I would actually argue with IT, you've had more technical debt being created within organizations because they don't know the business process. They've gotten so far away, when the CMO has so much technology, and I think that has been the genesis of it, because they've always said, oh, we can't support you, go off on your own and run Marketo and everything else that you need to go do it because we don't understand it. It's not the core business. I think that's when IT has lost the value into the organization, because you have shadow IT on the marketing side, basically, already at that point. we don't want to call it. I mean, that's the genesis of marketing operations. And it's just coming back down to the funnel, right? Like all the marketing technologies you've created, all the sales technologies have been created, all the customer success technologies have been created. I see so many people in customer stats of who runs Gainsight or Tatango. Not one person in IT. Who's doing the integrations? Not one person in IT. Because they've gotten so far away or they've gotten so non-technical, they missed with it. And so the technical debt, they have no control over back in the business and they've gotten away with it. Now, for a finance or an ERP or governance was like the finance pieces to manage the dollars, IT's been great there. Cybersecurity, IT's been great there. But they moved so far away from it that they've lost control. And I think operations has to stand there. My big view is you'll see a lot of operations or business ops systems owning the systems more and more, specifically when you get into Salesforce. And they'll have IT getting sucked into those sides instead of being in the finance or other areas in like 10 or 15 years.
Make sure you have the right personnel in those roles. You need that technical RevOps. And again, I think the idea of RevOps as truly removing all the silos, like being marketing ops, sales ops, finance ops, IT ops, CS ops, truly a RevOps organization has people that can do it all. And I do think that's the route that our group should go, because that's going to allow us to add the most value to an organization down the line.
IT can own help desk, they can own governance, they own security. That's where we go through, and you'll see the systems pieces go under the RevOps organization.
It's super interesting, and I've seen a variety of structures, but I think the one eternal principle that you've alluded to is like it has to be responsive to the business. As soon as a function gets far away from the business, inevitably the business just sort of recreates it closer to itself, and that's never a good dynamic. So will be interesting to see how it plays out. I want to thank you both. This has been just like super educational for me to flesh out this area of my knowledge. Hope it was equally so for some of the folks listening. Where can people find you on the web if they're interested in chatting with you about CPQ or anything else RevOps related?
I would go straight to our website at hyperscayle.com. Reach out to us, connect to us there. Hyperscayle with Y, Seayle. The person who owns hyperscayle.com has been selling airplanes for 40 or 50 years, so we can't touch that one.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was really great catching up. Most hope to speak to you again.
Awesome.
Thanks. It was awesome.
Appreciate it, Justin.
Hey, everyone. I want to invite you over to the RevOps FM Substack community, where you can sign up to get rough transcripts, show notes, longer form articles, and other bonus content. Just head over to revops.fm/subscribe to get free access. I'd also love to know what you thought of the episode and to hear suggestions for topics you want to learn about. Feel free to leave a comment on Substack or send me an email at justin@revops.fm. Thanks for listening.